Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Across State Lines. I'm your host, Danielle. Thank you so much for tuning into episode 7 of the podcast, where we will be discussing a very strange and detailed historical case, the murder of Annie Wiese. And I know a historical mystery might not be everyone's thing, but this one has a lot of twists and turns, and I was enthralled with the case while researching it. So I would love to hear your opinions about the case in the comment section if you choose to listen. In August of 1893, Annie was returning home from an evening at her friend's house when she was ambushed and stabbed to death and her throat slit. There were numerous suspects for the murder of Annie and a handful of arrests, but one woman who lived nearby had been put on trial for Annie's death when it was believed that samples of hair grasped firmly in Annie's fists matched the hair of the female suspect, and bloody handprints were found on the woman's barn. Strangely, when Annie was exhumed to re-examine her body for the trial, a new clump of hair was found in her hands, and it was believed that this clump of hair had been placed there after Annie was already buried, and that she had been dug up and her body tampered with. 2 trials ensued, yet there has never been justice for Anna Wiese. But before we jump into the case, I'd like to remind everyone that Across State Lines is available on all podcast streaming platforms, such as Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and wherever else you might be streaming. If you are liking Across State Lines and would like to leave us a rating or a review, it would be greatly appreciated. Now, let's jump into the case of Anna Wiese. Annie Wiese was born to parents Henry and Mary Wiese in Iowa on June 11, 1873. Annie's parents were German farmers who immigrated to the area, and Annie was described as tall and beautiful, charming, and stealing the hearts of many local men. However, Annie remained single, instead focusing on her work as a housekeeper, and by 1893 had already had 2 successful employments for families in town. At 20 years old, Annie was working as a housekeeper for the Russe family in Vienna Township, 9 miles northeast of Marshalltown, Iowa. Annie not only worked on the Russe property, but she had also resided there and had since May of 1893. Annie had her whole life ahead of her, and she was working hard to make it a good one. On August 26, 1893, Annie had finished up her chores at the Russe household and wanted to spend her night socializing with friends. After she had cooked dinner for the family and cleaned the kitchen, Annie retired to her room, pinned up her long auburn hair, and donned a black satin skirt and red blouse. Annie left the residence at 7 p.m. when it was not quite dark out and proceeded to walk south towards the Hill farm, roughly a half of a mile away. She was eager to visit the Hill's son Arthur and his wife Anna, with whom she was good friends. Along her trek, Annie came upon Dr. A.F. Walter and his wife Mary, who were driving their buggy along the dirt road. The pair were well acquainted, as Annie's brother Henry had worked for the Walters, and when the doctor and his wife saw Annie, they stopped and spoke with her. The couple were heading to the home of Adam and Fanny Jackson for a sing, as entertainment was hard to come by in the 19th century, and they had invited Annie along to join them and to share a watermelon together. Annie politely declined their offer, stating that she was making her way to the Hill farm. Not long after her encounter with the Walters, Annie next stumbled upon brothers John and Frank Knight, who were driving along the road in separate wagons. Before coming upon Annie, the men were at her place of employment, the Russes, where they spoke to Henry Russe about how they were hauling corn to nearby Green Mountain. Annie exchanged waves with the brothers and continued along the road until she got to the Hill farm. Once at the farm, Annie sat with her friends on kitchen chairs next to the open kitchen door, where she was spotted in the doorway by local townspeople passing by. Annie was described by the Hills as jovial and pleasant, and she had stayed at the farm enjoying their company until about 10 p.m. At 10, Annie left the farm and headed back along the moonlit road to the Russey residence. A short while later, on the Russey farm, head of the household Henry Russey was helping his invalid wife undress for bed when the couple had heard a scream. Henry stated that it sounded like a pig, but his wife Rebecca immediately recognized the voice as Annie's, and she pleaded with her husband to go out and check what was wrong. Henry ran outside to his barn where his hired hand, 14-year-old Perry Greggs, was attending to a sick cow and asked him if he had heard anything. Perry stated he had heard a scream, and Henry asked him to go check out where it had come from. With the boy being so young, he stated he was too scared to go alone, and then the two men proceeded to run out to the road together to investigate. About a quarter of a mile away, the two men found Annie, who was lying on her back in a ditch, legs bent at her sides. Having no lantern and depending solely on the moonlight, Henry told Perry that he believed Annie had fainted and to run to the nearby hill farm for help. The boy ran off to do just that. Arthur Hill arrived on scene with a lantern, and when they illuminated Annie, they could see that there were 3 pools of blood nearby, along with a maple wood club lying beside her, which had been broken. The top of Annie's blouse was covered in blood, and her hair was pulled down and matted, also soaked in blood. Annie's throat had been slit, and there were open, gaping wounds in her chest. It was evident that Annie was dead. While Arthur Hill ran for help from the neighbors, Henry Russey sat with the body and made sure that no one touched anything at the crime scene. In something he would later come to deny, neighbors reported that Henry held Annie's head in his lap and wept. Arthur would run to the Bennett farm where he pleaded for help from his horse, and Cyrus Bennett came to the door to answer the call. Cyrus would not allow his wife Emily to speak to Arthur, but instead sent his son, also named Arthur, to join in the search party for Annie's killer. At 1 a.m. on Sunday morning, coroner Dr. Wilfred F. David arrived on scene, where he did an examination in the moonlight of Annie's body. He noted that she had wounds to her chest, neck, breasts, and a deep gash on the right side of her body. He stated her eyes were wide open and her hair and hands were covered in blood. The men carried the body to the Russey home, and Dr. David immediately held an inquest with the 3 men. They deemed that Annie had been killed by a person or persons unknown. An examination of the scene of the murder was held in the daylight the next morning, and there they discovered hairpins strewn about, as well as tall weeds by a fence that had been trampled down, as if someone had been lying in wait in that spot. Along the fence, they found blood, and that someone had lifted the fence to crawl through it. On August 29th, at schoolhouse number 5, the coroner performed an autopsy of Annie's body, where it was determined that Annie had been stabbed a total of 10 times in the back and breast area. Her throat had been slashed from right to left with 2 short, superficial strokes, and 1 stroke so deep that it nearly decapitated the woman. The autopsy concluded that Annie had not been raped and had not been pregnant at the time of her death, despite her hymen not being intact. This finding had determined that the killer must not have been a lover who wanted to do away with Annie and a baby. In Annie's gripped fist, the coroner found a clump of auburn red hair. There had also been a clump of hair on Annie's head that had been cut during the attack with a knife. Both hair samples had been saved as evidence. Annie was given a funeral on August 30th at schoolhouse number 5 and was buried shortly after. The same day of the funeral, a local man named Albert Isengart was arrested for the murder of Annie Wiese. The 23-year-old barber was known to be in love with Annie, and within her possessions they found a note from Albert claiming that he had sold off a handful of his own possessions so they could marry. In the note, he told Annie not to laugh at him or his love for her. Annie had met Albert when she was working at her previous place of employment, the Bennetts. It was stated that Albert had called on Annie many times, but that she had no interest in him. He had seen Annie the Sunday previous, where he once again asked for her hand, and she denied him. However, Albert had an alibi for the night of the murder. He was working an overnight shift at a hay farm in Pocahontas County, where he had been all of Saturday and had slept at the farmer's home. Despite this, many people in town would continue to blame Albert, including the Bennetts. Investigators continued to search for clues, and much of their search was within the Bennett farm. The fence where the bloodstains were found was part of the Bennett property. Footprints found at the scene went from the fence, around the barn on the Bennett property, and towards the house. Bloody handprints were found on the wood of the barn, the kitchen door, and a porcelain doorknob. Once they searched the home, investigators discovered a blue blouse covered in bloodstains in a trunk underneath some papers. This blouse was unique as it had all the same buttons except for one, which had a man's trouser button. A button that matched the shirt was found halfway between the crime scene and the Bennett home. Annie's body was exhumed twice over 2 months, and shockingly, one of the times it was exhumed, her eyes were removed to send to Chicago so a photograph of the murderers could be obtained. Someone had come forward in the following months to claim that Horace Hill, Arthur Hill's brother, had confessed to the murder. Speaking to Horace Hill's former girlfriends, they learned that he had previously threatened to kill them on more than one occasion. Horace was soon arrested for the murder of Annie, but neighbors were so convinced of his innocence that they pooled $10,000 to post his bail until his next court hearing. He was soon exonerated when he provided a solid alibi of the night of the murder. He later sued the county for $10,000 for false imprisonment. While it was initially determined to be a murder by a male, possibly a scorned lover, investigators began to believe that the murderer might have possibly been a woman, with one investigator stating, quote, "None but a frenzied woman could do such a bungling hacking job," end quote. Soon, suspicion fell on Emily Bennett, as blood had been found not only at her home, but also on her blue blouse. Hair was taken from Emily to compare to the samples that were caught in Annie's fist. After their interview with her, it was said that Emily was highly agitated and nervous, and went on to slander Annie, stating that she had overheard Annie talking about doing immoral things with a man inside of a wagon, and that her son Arthur joined in. Emily was soon arrested for the murder, and during the arrest, she claimed that she had typhoid fever, perhaps in an attempt for them to stay away. While in jail, her past was probed into, where it was learned that before marrying Cyrus, she had been married once before. Her first husband had died under mysterious circumstances that were determined to either be murder or suicide. It was rumored that Emily had killed him and thrown him down a well, but others stated he died from consumption in his own bed. It's not able to be determined what the truth is, however. When Emily married Cyrus, she lied on her marriage certificate about her age, claiming that she was 36 and he was 38, but in fact, she was 44 years old. When Emily was arraigned, she was not present for the hearing. Instead, her lawyer showed up and declared her not guilty. They set her bail at $10,000, and once again, believing her innocence, neighbors, including the Russies, pooled their money together to post it for her. The bondsman stated, quote, "We, the undersigned bondsmen of Mrs. Emily Bennett, who is under indictment for the murder of Anna Wiese, hearing that certain rumors were current, namely, that we as bondsmen, in signing her bond, virtually said that we believed in the innocence of the defendant, and by our actions in the matter were to a certain degree shielding the defendant. We, and each of us, say that the question of guilt or innocence of defendant was not taken into consideration, the facts of which we know nothing about. But as the court had said that the defendant could be admitted to bail, our action followed merely as that of friends and neighbors. We stand on neutral ground, and we want to see justice meted out to the defendant, whether innocent or guilty." End quote. While the evidence against Emily was all circumstantial, the motive was determined to be that Emily believed Annie was a bad influence on her son and was luring him away from another girl he had been courting for 2 years. 2 other alternate theories came to light, one being that Emily was suspicious her husband was showing Annie too much affection, and that Annie had known Emily had killed someone else on the farm and was going to turn her in. During the trial, Annie was once again exhumed, despite the pleas of neighbors to just let her rest. A sample of Annie's hair was also clipped. A man who helped in the exhumation went on to say this to a newspaper, quote, "I helped take up the body, pushed the glass lid of the casket partway back, and assisted Mr. Ricker in getting samples of the dead girl's hair. Just as we were about to close the coffin again, I discovered a bunch of hair in her right hand, which was clasped over the left of her breast. There was a white mold fully a quarter of an inch thick adhering to the face, hands, and all exposed parts of the flesh. The hair, however, was free from this grave mold. That in her hand stood up in a sort of loop or bow above the second finger, and the ends were between and apparently under the index and third fingers. I called Mr. Ricker's attention to it and asked if we hadn't better bring it along with us. He said that it might be well to do so. I then reached under the glass and took the hair from the hand. It pulled as if being partially grasped or inserted under the fingers. I handed it to Mr. Ricker, who put it in an envelope and marked it hair in hand, and haven't seen it since. The hair was about 4 inches in length." End quote. This clump of hair was dark and coarse and determined to be from a male. Original investigators claimed that there was no other hair grasped in Annie's hand during their initial examinations, and it was theorized that someone may have paid to have Annie dug up, this hair placed in her hand, and reburied in anticipation of this next exhumation. In early April, the trial began. The men from the crime scene, along with Emily's sister, husband, and son, were all subpoenaed to testify. The jury was made up of all farmers. The prosecution put forth the theory that Emily had killed Annie because she had intimate relations with her son and possibly her husband. The physical evidence was laid out, as well as circumstantial evidence. Annie would routinely visit the Bennett home on Sundays. Emily spread rumors that Annie was immoral and pregnant, and Emily knew Annie's routine of visiting the Hill home on Sunday evenings. It was theorized that Emily had donned men's clothing, hunkered down near the fence, and waited for Annie to pass by before attacking her. The physical evidence was the footprints, bloody handprints on the Bennett farm, the button found near the scene, scrapings from under Annie's nails matching fibers from Emily's blue shirt, the wood from the club matching the soft maple trees found on the Bennett farm. Emily's reddish hair matched the hair clasped in Annie's hand. The stabbings were done from the left hand, which Emily was ambidextrous, and Emily had done her best to ensure the arrest of Albert to take suspicion off of herself. The defense had their own remarks. They claimed that Emily was 50 years old and only 120 pounds and was frail, so she couldn't have attacked Annie. They believed only a man could subdue Annie, who was in excellent shape and 5'11". Emily's left arm had been out of its socket since childhood, which made it impossible for her to have stabbed Annie with her left hand. They claimed that the bloodstains on the fence and the barn were from dehorning cattle, and friends who were at the farm the day before the murder claimed it was actually cherry juice. They claimed that Emily had been asleep when Arthur Hill arrived at their home to help with the situation, and that her son had never been out with Annie before, and Emily had no worry that he would, as he was courting someone else. They stated that the hair found in Annie's hand was her own hair, and stated that even Annie's parents did not believe that Emily was guilty. In total, the jury deliberated for nearly 40 hours after all testimonies and statements concluded. The first ballot received stated that 7 voted for acquittal and 5 for prosecution. The next ballot was tied, and the jury was tied. The third ballot, the next day after breakfast, stated that 9 voted for acquittal and 3 for prosecution. During breakfast, one of the jurors, Henry Desch, collapsed from stomach pain and bleeding bowels and could not continue. Due to this, the judge dismissed the jury, and the case would go to trial for a second time. On September 6, 1894, the second trial began. The prosecution and defense testimonies were the same, and it seemed that the second jury was less invested than the first. When invited to visit the crime scene, the jury declined. Arthur Bennett testified that he had no interest in Annie and that the prosecution theory was flawed. And Cyrus testified for 5 full hours, where he claimed his wife was wearing a plaid dress on the night of the murder and put it on again on Sunday morning. Emily herself decided to testify, and during this, she showed no emotion, and she also did not get confused during her testimony nor contradict herself. Strangely, during the trial, one of the jurors became violently ill, such as in the case of the first trial. This man regained his strength, however, and continued on. Prosecution this time claimed that there were 2 weapons, a club and a knife, and that the perpetrator did not act alone. They believed that Emily was assisted by either her husband or her son. On September 22nd, the jurors deliberated and 4 ballots came in. The first one, they were evenly split. The second, 7 voted for acquittal and 4 for prosecution. The third, 11 voted for acquittal and 1 for prosecution. And on the final vote, all 12 jurors voted to acquit Emily Bennett. When asked how Emily kept her cool during the trial, she stated, "Why shouldn't I?" With the end of the trial comes the end of the mystery of who killed Annie Wise, as no one else was ever arrested for her murder. Despite her acquittal, many townspeople believed that Emily was responsible and justice was never found for Annie. They also wondered if someone had poisoned the food for the jurors to throw the trial off track. In the summer of 1894, town residents pooled money for a tombstone for Annie, which bore the inscription, "In memory of Anna Wise, foully murdered August 26, 1893, aged 20 years, 2 months, and 15 days, erected by generous and sympathizing friends. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord." They vowed then and there that Annie would never be exhumed again, and she would be finally able to rest in peace. After 132 years, it is incredibly unlikely Annie's killer will ever be known. Thank you so much for listening to Across State Lines, and we will be back next week to dive into another unsolved case. Please follow or subscribe to Across State Lines on your podcast listening platform, so that way new episodes will drop directly into your listening feed. If you'd like to rate or review Across State Lines on whatever platform you listen to, it would be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much, and join us again next week.